Okay, we're going to get started on our third panel, which is establishing government as a digital leader. We have three, again, excellent panelists here with us today. David Bray, who's the Executive Director of People-Centered Internet, which is a new, just call yourself nonprofit, or do you call
Coalition.
Coalition, founded by Metzger. David was previously a CIO at FCC. To his left, Meagan Metzger is the founder and CEO of Decode 42, which does a lot of great work with the federal government. And then at the far end, Andrew Trueblood, Chief of Staff for the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development with the DC government, where he's been working on a lot of data-related projects and bringing that into the policy process. So I wanted to end with this question and this kind of focus on this panel about, again, how can government become a digital leader again? I would say, if you kind of go way back, right? If you look at the earliest uses of technology, things like, when the DoD was using, technology to project, to make projections about, where missiles were going to go, where you had the Census Bureau using, the ENIAC or UNIVAC computers to do, some of the initial processing. They were the technology leaders. They were ahead of industry at the time. And the question is, can we get back to that kind of nostalgic past again? Is there a future where the government is actually the leader, where it says, we can be the bigger risk taker than the private sector. We can experiment more with technology. We can prove concepts, and we can share these ideas, for it to be widely used to benefit citizens and also to help industry. So let me just throw that out there as an initial question. David, let me start with you, because you've both been kind of in government immediately, and now you're kind of on the outside looking in. I'd love your thought on what the potential is for that and how we might achieve it.
So how can we get government to be a digital leader again? That's an interesting question to ask. The two first thoughts that I would toss out, first to be a little bit provocative, but also paraphrase Shakespeare, the first thing we should do is get rid of all the lawyers. I think the challenge is the law as written has massive challenges of scaling for the digital era. And I know the previous panel was talking about some of the challenges when it comes to AI and trying to use machine learning to try and identify where there's complexity, where there's things that are redundant or things that are gaps. The law was never designed to be ahead of emerging tech issues. If you think about it, obscenity laws came before privacy laws. Obscenity laws came about at about the turn of the century when people actually started moving into cities, and they would look out their window and they're like, well, maybe I don't want to look at my window and see certain things. So that kind of about obscenity laws. Privacy laws came about in the 1970s when there was this thing called advanced data processing and concerns that correlations might be produced from this processed data that you actually had not given consent to be known. So the law is always playing catch up with what technology can do. I think the challenge we have is, as you mentioned, back in the 50s and the 60s, technology was not necessarily as readily available in the hands of consumers as it is now. And so there's now almost the expectation. If you think about it, when the Obama administration was inaugurated, I believe the stats were less than 10% of the US actually had a smartphone. And now we're looking at upwards of 70% do. And that's massive change in the last 10 years, less than 10 years even. And so there's the expectation that we will change, and I'll use the word instead of government, I'll use the word public service, because increasingly I think it's about not just what government professionals do, but what the private sector can do in partnership with government, as well as what public individuals can do themselves. Because how many of you do have a smartphone, by the way? Just curiosity. Okay, I probably should ask how many you don't have, but if you don't, that's fine. If you have a smartphone, according to some statistics, you have more computing power than President Reagan had back in 1981 through the Pentagon. And that the next 1 billion people on the face of the planet that will get a smartphone will get it for less than 45 bucks. So that is transformative in the nature of how we interact as human beings. So I think that would be the first thing. The second thing, actually, I think is there is currently, and I want to say this politely, but there is currently a financial incentive for some of the private sector to maintain the status quo in what we do in public service. They're currently making a profit off it. And to allow disruptive players to come in, to allow new ideas and to change that way, challenges how they're currently making money. And the challenge is, of course, they have vested interest that can then talk to people on the Hill, and so when you try to say maybe we should streamline acquisition or things like that, everyone will do hand waving, but does anything actually come out of it? That's a bit of a challenge. Meanwhile, if you're on the inside as a government person and you try to make this case to the Hill or the administration, you look self-interested, so you're not listened to. And so the only real way this will change is if enough of us on the outside start saying we want this to happen and to create that pressure, and then that will create the opportunity. Because I've been a big believer that we get the government we deserve. And so if we're not pressing for our government to be seen as a digital leader, if we're not pressing for digital workers in public service to have the autonomy to actually see what they can do and run experiments, because not all of this will work out. Let's face it, how many of us have the patience for Silicon Valley to try different experiments? We probably do. We consider that a startup culture. But if there was something that was tried in government and didn't work out, how many of us would have the patience after the second or third attempt to say, oh, that's just them trying to figure out their new model versus, oh, that's a waste of taxpayer funds. And I'll end with one last thought. How many of you know what Project Corona was? Project Corona was 1958, 1959. Basically, ARPA at the time, so the predecessor to DARPA, and CIA were charged with launching a rocket that would fly over, at the time, the Soviet Union, take photos, have that film capsule then be parachuted back over the ocean and be picked up by a helicopter or by a plane before it splash landed into the ocean. 1958, 1959. So we haven't even actually started the space race yet in NASA. The first 13 rockets blew up before ever reaching orbit. The next 4 or 5 got into orbit that didn't succeed in actually taking the pictures. The next 4 or 5 after that took pictures, but they weren't actually picked up before they landed in the ocean. And it wasn't until around attempt number 21, 22 that they succeeded. Now, after all that, eventually that imagery was declassified in 1995 as part of Project Keyhole. That declassified imagery turned out to be the basis of Google Maps, which we now all use. So I often say that actually government is extremely innovative. We're not ones that monetize it, and in fact we shouldn't be the ones that monetize it. But again, I raise Project Corona because if we tried Project Corona today, how many of us would have patience to have those 13 different rockets blow up before we actually press forward and actually had it succeed? So at the end of the day, I think the only way government will be a digital leader is first, address the regulations and laws that hold you back. 2, address the financial incentives that are currently incentivizing maintaining legacy versus going beyond and being disruptive. And then finally, public pressure to actually ask for that to occur.
Thanks. Meagan, why don't you continue on with that same question?
Sure. So, and just to kind of back up, and I agree with a lot with what David's saying, but the question is, can they become a digital leader? I think the answer is yes. I want to be a little controversial and say, should they? So and I think part of that comes down to how are we actually defining innovation in this digital transformation and this wave of technology that's coming through. And you look at things that are evolutionary and you look at things that are revolutionary. Now, there are some amazing programs, like David's saying, that come out of the government, things that have been developed that we use in everyday life that started with the government, iRobot, to name a couple of different things. But then there's stuff, if we're looking at how to innovate the government, there's just some everyday things that the government is still using, cobalt to do. So leveraging the expertise of the private sector to adopt technologies to help them function more efficiently is one avenue versus putting in R&D dollars into things that can really change the world. So the role in that first piece, I think, of the government and where they can become a leader is if they start adopting these technologies and actually taking that risk. Companies that receive contracts with the government are then funded. They have some stability and can go on and grow as companies and kind of sustain economic downturns and all that. So it's really making an investment in the American economy and in the technology economy if the government does adopt different technology. Back to David's point, though, we can dive into a whole course of reasons that that is not happening, and I think there's some low-hanging fruit on things the government can do, and then there's going to be the bigger items that are kind of like turning a barge that we can get there, though.
Andrew.
So I am going to bring a little bit of a different perspective. While I have worked in the federal government, I currently am working for the DC government. And I don't think I don't think anyone would argue that local governments have ever been big investors in research and development. I think they're much more retail level things like potholes and rats. And so I think that there are a couple things on our level, though, that still, I think that doesn't mean there can't be leadership and there can't be digital leadership and innovation. So I think the thing that we see the greatest value of local government is in providing data. There's a whole host of data that we can provide either for citizens to get engaged or that companies then build their models off of. Transit data is a great example, and there are a whole host of companies, including Google Maps, that use open transportation data. Permitting data is used by all sorts of real estate companies and startups. So one of the things that we've been focused on is open data, and I know you had a whole conversation about that, but I think in terms of innovation and digital leadership, I think that's where the local government, that's really the biggest bang for the buck that we can have. I mean, David, to your point, it's really about partnerships. It's about how do we partner to help private and nonprofit firms. What are the things that we can do? So data provision is one of them. Another thing that we've done in the past is using our contracting power. So those firms that are out there trying to prove concepts, we will issue a contract to them in order to help them get revenue and help them test concepts out. So I think there are things that we try to do, especially at the local economic development level. If it's a local firm, that we can help grow that firm, grow the employment. That's something that we're very interested in. So the final piece is, I'll say, within government and the way we work, there's obviously a lot of opportunity constantly to improve. Throughout the government, we're looking for ways of deploying new solutions to various systems problems. I will tell you, I hear almost every day, well, why can't you just, we can do X, Y, and Z off the shelf really easily. Why can't you do that for this particular government service? And it's oftentimes complicated, but it's something we're doing. And I think the answer to that, the thing that I've seen, the success of that has been a combination of strong leadership, leaders at agencies that want to be innovative and forward-leaning. In our city, a good example is our Department of For-Hire Vehicles, which used to be our taxi cab commission. They've sort of been forced to innovate by the market. And they have interesting examples. They have an open public dashboard of really interesting data that they gather, but they also use that for their own decision making. But at the same time, they've also been innovating on actual regulatory apparatuses. So how do they regulate such that cabs are competitive in the new market, and how do we think about the other for-hire vehicles? So I think that leadership is an important one. And then the other thing I've seen is then obviously the staff level, people in the different agencies who are able to then actually move that stuff forward, work on it day to day, care about it, go up against the law, go up against people who are, contractors who are against it, go up against the everyday challenges to move those kinds of things forward. And that's where we've seen the successes.
Great, and so to be clear, when I'm talking about government as a digital leader, I'm really talking about digital adoption, not the creation. So it's not can government come up with the next iPhone? It's is government first in line at the iStore, at the Apple Store when there's the new product out there? Are they the ones that are ready to be the first adopter? So let me ask. So we did a report. Earlier this year looking at federal government websites. We assessed them on security, accessibility, page load speed, and mobile friendliness. So we collected data last year in November, and we collected data this year in September, and we released 2 reports. And basically both times across the board, federal agencies weren't doing too well at even meeting their own requirements, and they were doing worse when you kind of benchmark them against what industry was doing. Now, this is just kind of basic, can you build a website that works the way people expect it to work? If we're talking about emerging technology, how do we get government to be good at that when it has trouble doing some of the basics? David, let me start with you, because I don't have the data in front of me. I'm pretty sure FCC wasn't one of the ones that was doing badly. So maybe you can speak a little bit to how you get it right.
True. Well, actually, let me turn this on. So it's interesting that you mentioned, and I can say this, I guess, now I'm on the outside, but when I arrived at the... roller coaster. So I arrived at the FCC in 2013. There had been 9 COs in 8 years, which I say is always a great sign for CO number 10, that things are going just swimmingly and everything's perfect. Granted, that was about 4 years ago. But one of the things that I was being asked, actually, by both people on the inside as well as people on the outside, was when was I going to update the website? And it turned out the website had been updated back in 2010, so that wasn't too long ago. But people wanted to go back to the website of 1999. And you might say, well, why? Does it actually look like it was developed in front page 95? It probably was, and it wasn't that great. apparently the challenge you have, unlike commercial websites, is you go to government to find information. And if that information is rejiggered in how you search for it or find it, you get frustrated. Even if it looks old, you get used to the patterns. And so and that's also where I admit, the redesign of the FCC website in 2010, they did something they wanted to make it Web 2.0 friendly. So connected to Facebook, LinkedIn, all the others. And I know my wife loves me, but when I was at the FCC, I don't think she felt a compelling need to check the FCC website on a daily basis. That's when you realize that a lot of government is, while we do talk about government to consumers, a lot of government is government to certain stakeholders or key constituents or almost businesses. And so when you do any redesign of your website, yes, you need to think about the public, but you also need to think about those key constituents that are looking for things, that if you don't include them and you now have somehow changed how they find things, yes, it may look newer, but they're going to get really frustrated. So the good news is the way we fixed this, because they'd only updated it back in 2010, so it was only 3 years ago. And they brought in folks from Silicon Valley and everything like that, and so it had been a very well-intentioned effort that just unfortunately did not talk to the right stakeholders when they redesigned it. Was I politely said we will use data to drive how our current website is being used, how it's not being used, and then have conversation with the stakeholders to figure out which pieces we refresh. And so after about a year of doing this, and in fact, throughout the process, we would storyboard and we'd get people's feedback. We eventually went live with the storyboard, then we went live with the prototype. So we never fully turned the switch until it had sort of already been hard tested by all the stakeholders. And that was the key to make it succeed. Mm-hmm. But I do think that shows that government's a little bit different than business, because business, you can pick who you want to be your consumers. You can pick your audience. Government, you've got to serve everybody, including people in very remote rural areas that don't have a high-speed connection, different needs in terms of accessibility you definitely have to take in mind. And so that does make things a little bit different, but there's still an opportunity. And so I think the big key is rapid prototyping with the right stakeholders, get their involvement, go out and actually meet with them face-to-face, and actually have humility and say, look, I don't have all the answers. And I know that this may not work right on the first time, but have patience with us and tell us how to make it better and make it improved. And again, that's where I get to, I'm just worried that the internet, while it's made us more transparent, it's also made us all armchair quarterbacks. And so it's really easy to say what's wrong or what's broken and say, how could they have possibly done that? It's harder to then say, how can I help you make it better? And we've got to figure out more mechanisms to do that. And that's why I use the word public service versus government, because a lot of these things, we're taking things that date back to the postal era, done by mail back in 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, that does not scale well for the digital era. And so yes, they're not great. But instead of saying, how could that have possibly been done, they must be silly, we need to figure out ways that we can actually tap the larger community to actually say, how can we make it better together?
Yeah. Meagan, let me have you maybe pick up on that question and also ask, are there lessons to be learned from this experience with the websites in terms of what we're building for today isn't necessarily what we're going to want tomorrow? How do we think more about it, not maybe future-proofing it, but making sure we have a good upgrade trajectory, a upgrade pathway?
Yeah, absolutely. David kind of mentioned the government doesn't get to pick our constituents, and I would say we have no choice because the reverse is true. Our customers aren't picking the government. They're stuck with us, right? So we need to meet their expectations. But one thing I think that we can leverage from the private sector and why they're putting out these gorgeous websites and digital experiences that people want to engage with them and find the information is looking at it from product management versus project management. And I can tell you from previous consulting days, and I actually worked on a number of WordPress and Drupal builds, that it was all project management with no usability testing built in. So to David's point, if you don't usability test your website with the audiences that are actually going to use it, they're going to be wandering around the page going, where in the hell is that button? Excuse my French. So, and product management does not replace project management. Product management is just focused on what is the outcome, the actual product that we need, and core to that is the customer or the consumer of that information. And of course you need project management to make sure you stay on time and in budget and all of that, but shifting the government's management style to be more product focused, I think would benefit everyone that's building even internal websites. I mean, how many agencies are working with other agencies and their consumers are just as important because they need to find that information fast.
So we're going to be doing a follow-up study looking at state websites. We haven't decided if we're
You're on
going to
notice.
DC, but
Yes,
you should. So
Yes.
you should.
They're equivalent of a state, not a state.
But let me throw that same question out to you. I mean, as you're thinking about this, basically the struggle with, obviously many local governments struggle with doing some of the basic tech.
Yeah.
And then they start hearing people saying, then why aren't you doing the emerging tech? And how do they strike that balance?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think in general with government, you talk about a resource-constrained environment in most cases, even in the federal government, and I think that is just magnified at the state and local level. So the reason you have project management is because you have the bare minimum to get the website up and running with the bare minimum resources oftentimes. But I will say one thing, to Megan's point, I see much more now design, UX, either in-house or being contracted, UX designers and folks in that world, and I think that makes a huge difference. I think it really does. The idea that it's not just about getting the product, it's not just about getting a website delivered, it's about getting something that people care about. And the nice thing about local government is you actually hear about it. I mean, you hear from your constituents when things work, and you hear when they don't work. I think in a way that sometimes the federal government's a little bit further away from everyday users. So I think that's, I think we struggle with it, to be honest. You can go visit DC Gov's website. It's not the worst, I don't think, but it's probably not it's not Amazon. I think it's something that we try to work on. The other thing that I do see is that is the partnerships. And we will partner oftentimes with organizations like Code for DC or others to help us do various elements, if not a website, but various tools or other things. A great example that we just put out was this Housing Insights project, which is a combination, a tool, it's data that they pulled together. They partnered with Urban Institute and some other nonprofits for us to get a better sense of what is happening with the affordable housing market in DC and where potential affordable housing could be lost. So it's a great tool for government, it's a great civic tool, and it was done in partnership with the civic hackers and with nonprofits. And so that's, I think if you have specific projects, that can be a really great venue to get those kinds of things done.
I wanted to just add, obviously we talked about the process for how to put out these new digital experiences, but also looking at the underlying tools that can enable how different audiences want to consume information, because we're in an interesting point in time where I would say the younger generation, the folks that are now starting their first entrance into interacting with the government, grew up on smartphones and mobile devices, and they have one expectation. And then we have the other end of the spectrum where they still want to print a form, and they still want to mail that in, and that's the expectation. And so looking for the tools and technologies that can actually enable you to accommodate all of those users is going to be important as we start that transition to a fully digital experience. But I've seen a couple of agencies actually, take a full steam, full charge ahead into a digital experience, completely turn off the other, and then that's not the answer either. Yeah. You need to kind of help guide your users to the right path.
How do we, David, let me continue. I just want to follow up on a point both you and Meagan made, which was, you talked about, you get the government, you demand. How do you capture that pressure? Because part of it is a question of, well, maybe the signals there is not being captured by government. How do we make sure we're capturing it well? One of the things that struck me with TSA, they did a pilot, I think they started maybe last summer, where they had the satisfaction, the little smileys, which a lot of agencies have done. But what was striking to me is that when they announced they were doing the pilot, they said at the beginning, we're not going to release the data. They just said, we're going to keep the data while it's a pilot internal. And you think, if you really want to be open about it, you make the data public. People can interpret it, but if you're doing this trial to see what people think about it, why not make that public? It seemed to me it was kind of going against the idea that we really care what you think, because they were worried about how it might be misinterpreted. So how do we correctly capture feedback? How do we make sure that people think not only they can make their voice heard, but then they actually believe it has been heard? Because I think that's part of the process as well.
So you hit on a very key point, and actually to amplify what Meagan and Andrea were saying. So most Western democracies, representative democracies, were designed to treat everybody the same way. We've all had the DMV experience where we go and it treats us all the same way. We all have to wait in line, and we may not like it, but it is at least consistent and equitable to everybody. And that was part of Western democracy is you treat everybody equitably. The challenge of what's happening in the consumer space is everybody's experiencing with apps and with microservices personalization to the level of one tailored to your own specific desires and needs. And so you're seeing that happen in the consumer space, and people are like, well, why can't I get that from my government? Well, to be honest, if we had personalization in most cases at the level of one in government, that might look like either favoritism or it might work like targeting. And nobody really wants that. But at the same time, there is this expectation, like exactly what you said, which is I want to have the experience match what I want, whether it's from the fully digital experience or I still want to use the paper form experience. There's also huge debates about, there is a segment of the US population that would love to have their taxes pre-filled and say, here's what we think you owe. You can then adjust them if you want, but there'd be another segment of the US population that would be like, no way, no how am I ever going to give enough data to the government to have that be done? And that is sort of the challenge of the plurality. I mean, everyone points to Estonia and says, look at what Estonia did. It's like, yeah, they're a small nation that's fairly homogenous and within a very tight geospatial area. That's not the United States. And so our own plurality is making it hard to pick up the signals for what people want government to be. And I think that's where Andrew has a little bit of an advantage because DC is more local and you can have a more tight constituency. So,
are you saying we should pre-fill everyone's taxes?
I actually think you should. I'm actually getting to the idea of choice architectures. And what does that mean by that? That you allow people to pick one of different paths. And so you can choose to give no government data whatsoever. That means you have to manually fill out your taxes every year. Or you can say, look, I'm willing to share the following data with the revenue service over time, and in return, the taxes are actually pre-filled for me automatically. I can take a look at it and adjust it if you miss something, but I don't have to file them manually. It's almost done for me on a continuous basis, but it's a choice as to which path I need to take. And that's where I said the biggest hurdle for us being a leader in digital experiences is the law currently doesn't allow us to do that. The law says you can only do one path. The same thing true for giving signals and feedback. The question is, there's some people that would like to actually have, one comment per person, which would require the government to actually have some way of actually authenticating your identity. There'd be other people that say, I don't want to do that because I want to leave a comment and do it anonymously. Well, then that means you have no way of actually verifying, was this one person leaving 1 million comments or was this 1 million unique people leaving comments? And so that sort of trade-off and that discussion is not happening, partly because we in the public are not encouraging our people in government to have those conversations. It's seen right now as a fairly geeky/wonky conversation. But I think that's where we here with the center and actually talking about data can say, so much of this is about giving people choices and not having a monolithic process that is one size fits all, and then allowing that to then sort of guide where they go based on the data.
Andrew, so we've been talking a lot about kind of the citizen as the customer of kind of digital adoption and digital transformation. But obviously a big part of technology and government is also to use it internally for policy planning and other kind of internal processes. Can you talk a little bit about what DC has been doing in this space? And I think DC is probably one of the leaders in this space. What made it possible? What kind of looking back, what enabled you to make those types of transformations that said, yeah, we're going to make technology a core part of the process of governing?
Sure. Well, and I mean, to take a step back, I think there's lots of really interesting things happening in cities and counties and states really across the country. I think I am working for a major city. I think the cities are doing the most interesting things generally, and you can choose a different city and find them each doing something very interesting and transformative in a different part of city services in the digital sphere. I think the very basic need, and I think I have seen this firsthand, is really leadership from the top down. I mean, I think you need a leader in terms of a mayor and in terms of a chief technology officer and an agency director, if that's a solution, if that's in the agency, that are all aligned and willing to push forward. In our example, one thing I'm particularly proud of in the city is we have a group called the Lab DC, and they have where our user experience designers are, but they also do testing of policies. So for example, when we did body-worn cameras, they used that as when we deployed them, they used that as an opportunity to do a scientifically rigorous test, statistically rigorous test on what the outcome was. And so it's really interesting. They're doing a number of really interesting things. One of which is Like other cities, we have stats. We have, like city stats, and New York invented, obviously, crime stat in the 90s. I mentioned rats earlier. We had rat stat earlier this week, and one of the things that was really interesting is the lab looked at models of how to predict where rats are. It's actually, you can model it pretty closely. If you guys think about it, things like zoning or building use is an important one. They congregate towards restaurants or things like that. Age of building is an important one, obviously. I mean, I should say obviously. I didn't even think about this until I saw their presentation. And then the other one, what's the other one? Density. The more people you have, the more rats. So anyway, the idea of applying innovative ways of thinking about, okay, how do we abate rats in the city, and where are we best using our limited resources, I think are things that we're trying to do. And I could see, already our Department of Public Works is trying to use real-time data in terms of complaints, in terms of work tickets, to be faster and more effective in the ways that they do whatever they do, whether it's picking up trash or snow or rats. So that's my favorite example for you guys today.
What is the probability we see a rat when we leave this building?
It's getting dark, so yeah.
Tell us after we're done. Meagan, can you talk a little bit about the same kind of issue? I mean, when you've been working with agencies, are you seeing them thinking about also kind of balancing this internal versus external dimension of their technology projects?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are a technology accelerator that's focused squarely on government, if you're not familiar with Decode. So when we bring in emerging technologies, we get to live the pain 50 times a year, if you will, of companies attempting to do this. And I want to address the internal and the external separately. So from an external perspective, opening it up to public comment. So we review an app, we go on Yelp, actually look up Yelp for national parks, it's very hilarious. But we take those companies that have feedback, take that and incorporate that in, and if they don't, they disappear as a business. So if the government did adopt something like that, that's a very easy thing to do, theoretically. The challenge is going to be the internal politics around things like that, in the way that David kind of hit on, the way that government incentivizes both policy and acquisition and things like that. So put yourself in a government shoe, government stakeholder shoe. You don't get promoted, but you will get in trouble if someone, if something gets out to the press that you did something poor. So same with a contractor. So the fear and the risk aversion is if I put out something that I've built for open comment, and then the press gets wind of it, or maybe it didn't turn out the way that I thought it would, am I either not going to get my incentive fee as part of my contract, or am I going to get scolded as a government stakeholder? So there's a risk aversion, and like he's saying, if we can build up leadership that understands that's part of the process, and that's a actual healthy thing to go through from a digital transformation perspective, then we can start kind of changing the culture internally to do that. Looking internally for kind of internal communications and adoption, I think there's also just a need for better technology so that people can develop and build these experiences. The government's done a pretty decent job lately of recruiting, outside talent to bring in the younger folks and bring in data scientists and bring in the Silicon Valley teams, and you hear about it. And the number one complaint that we hear as we're working with them is that I don't have the tools I need to get my job done. So we want better digital experiences. We're talking about digital first, and how do we engage with citizens, or how do we build technologies to engage more collaboratively internally, but I can't get to GitHub and I can't use a CDCI tool and kind of the basic things that they're used to on the outside. So it's a kind of a, which is it a chicken egg? Do you need to innovate your processes or innovate your technology first? And I think they need to happen in parallel. But from the leadership perspective, support the folks that drive that top-down leadership. That's absolutely important, but don't mistake that for cramming innovation down people's throats, which there is a difference, because the people on the ground that are living the pain of executing your mission every single day are your best innovators. So the leaders that succeed in the federal government are the ones that listen to the people that are on the ground and use that to kind of crowdsource the ideas of where is the lowest hanging fruit for my innovation efforts, and then use your leadership ability to start moving those changes forward.
So wanted to build on what Meagan said. So 10 years ago, less than 10% of individuals either in Europe or North America thought that direct democracy was better than representative democracy. And more recently, according to Pew Research, it's now past 50%. And so that's an interesting change, because we do need to remember that we are constitutionally a representative democracy or republic, depending whether you side with Jefferson or Madison. But basically the same thing is we elect our leaders and then they basically run the government insofar that they remain elected. The Yelp model, while interesting, sort of is kind of subversive to representative democracy, because now you're actually saying, here's what I want you to do as a citizen directly to the agency and bypassing the elected leaders. And that's kind of an interesting challenge. Now, that may be where the world is going for the West, but I raise that because that is sort of this tension, because I've been on the side before, both underneath D's and underneath R's, where I will get through social media citizens saying, well, you're there to serve us, we want you to do the following. And it's like, well, actually, you can elect the people that will then tell us what to do, but you actually cannot tell me what directly to do, because we are constitutionally a representative democracy. And I just raise that out there because that is a changing shift that may be occurring as a result of the internet. The other trend that's also been happening in the last 3 to 4 years is what's called the rise of subnationalism. You can already see Canada is actually forming trade agreements directly with cities, bypassing national governments. And so that raises interesting questions about where are we going? Are we going to be direct democracy? Are we going to be more city-states in terms of how the relationships are done? There's pros and cons with that. Actually, if you go back to the founders, they were worried that direct democracy would result in mob rule, but it raises interesting questions about where we go. That's where I keep on going back to the idea that you're never going to have one solution that makes everybody happy. And it's going to have to be choice architectures. And so the three things I would say is, can I give you the option if you want to volunteer data that you've collected? It would be kept anonymous and be kept private, but if it was on air quality, water quality, it could help inform your local community and actually bring attention to issues in your area. But you don't have to do it if you don't want to. I think, two, we need to actually have the ability to query what data government has about you. Barring anything that's either law enforcement or national security related, just imagine how that would create a seismic shift to actually say, Department of Agriculture, Department of Treasury, I want to know everything you have about me. I want to take a look at it and be able to fix that. That would be a massive change in how we organize data. And then lastly, being able to show what's being done, data in organizations, and then actually show where you can actually make choices in it. So sort of like a weekly sort of, here's a snapshot of what's being done in these different departments. And then if you want to actually have choices, and again, it's choices plural, not one size fits all, here are the different options you have.
I just want to, okay, here we go. I want to extend, David, the first thing you said, because I actually have a very tangible project that we're working on that I think is sort of like that, which is we're trying to create a survey panel in the city. Well, one thing that we struggle with is census data is really good, but even like American community census data it lags. And so, I mean, what happened here 3 years ago feels like a generation in our world. So how do we get more up-to-date data and understanding of what's happening in the city and how the residents are feeling? So we're talking about putting together a survey panel, which would complement, we would actually structure it to complement census, but the idea is it would be an opt-in, and people would know they're a part of it, we'd have their background, and they would give us the demographic information, and then it would be much easier to ask them just 3 questions once a month. There's an example of this it was actually started in Philly, called Philly Speaks, but I think the idea is that we can understand much better what's happening and be able to respond quicker. But it's an opt-in,
right,
which I think is an important element.
Very key.
I want to go back to a point, Meagan, you had made about you don't want to kind of cram down from the top down innovation. I want to not really challenge you on it, but I want to present a counterexample and ask you to kind of react to it. So the Obama administration. So I guess it was 2013 when they did the executive order on open data that first said release 3 high-value data sets, and within a certain period of time, and that really forced a lot of agencies to 1, take a look at what data they had, then 2, decide what was actually valuable, and then 3, get it out there. Even if they hadn't figured out the whole open data plan yet, they started to make progress. So the panel before this one was around artificial intelligence and how we're still seeing agencies kind of struggling with getting going. That there's a lot of little projects, but basically, can we have something like that in some of these areas where we know the technology is impactful because we're already seeing it pay off, and we have a lot of insights into how it's working in industry or in other countries, and we can say, just as we did with open data, every agency pick 3 areas that are going to be the highest impact for AI and pursue it. Is that too contradictory with the top-down mentality, or is that the kind of leadership that's useful while still letting, giving flexibility to the kind of bottom grassroots?
Yeah, a fantastic leader, I would say, knows how to leverage both, because the government workforce is very mixed right now. You're going to have people that have been there a long time that are going to go kicking and screaming into the future, and then you're going to have the people on the ground that really, they see a problem, they want to fix the problem, and David's term, change agent, they're the true change agents. So, we can't say that all innovation needs to come from the bottom up. That's unrealistic. Look at Steve Jobs. We wouldn't have the iPhone if he didn't just tell us all what we thought he thought we needed. But he probably had folks in the ranks that said, I support your idea, let me help you get there, versus him saying, we're doing this whether you like it or not. So I think it's a little bit of both, in saying you need the leader to say, we're going to AI, Kennedy, we're going to the moon, and then work with your folks down on the ground to figure out how that needs to happen, versus telling them how that needs to happen, and then you'll get there. But I don't think just relying on the top or relying on the bottom is the answer. You need a blend.
So to amplify with Megan, I agree 100% with what she said. So I actually was ghostwriting papers on a nonpartisan basis when that question came out. And they buried the paper we wrote, which said, one, you haven't even assessed if the data that you release might actually eliminate jobs, because now that actually there may have been companies that were providing clean data sets to other companies that now you've made available as a government, and so just by tossing it out there, that actually there's no forethought with it. And then 2, if you actually look what happened, unfortunately the first round of data.gov was a lot of PDFs, which is really hard to query. And so sort of build on what Megan's point, I think it almost went too far to the tactics. What really should have happened at the top is, we want to see results in open data in the next 6 months, and then allow a groundswell of ideas from both the outside, from both the public and the private sector, but also people inside of government that say, make your pitches. We're going to now try and do 16, we're going to down select down to 8, and then we're going to down select down to 4. But I feel like it got too far into the tactics, and so that's where, again, that's where you need that balance of top provides the vision, but then it's the change agents that are actually at the edge and have that context-aware situation. Now, the challenge I would say is AI is way too big for any one department or agency, with the exception of possibly Department of Defense and the intelligence community to do. They're already having problems getting to the cloud, and so we somehow expect they're going to somehow leapfrog and forget the problems they're having getting to the cloud and somehow magically get to AI. I think the best way to tackle AI for public service, because it fundamentally changes how you interact, is you actually need to save a percentage of the federal budget for civilian agencies. Maybe it's 0.5%, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. And say, we're going to announce 3 broad initiatives that are citizen-facing. How are we going to use AI to solve the jobs issue and retraining? How are we going to use AI to actually reduce the cost of healthcare for individuals? How are we going to use AI to possibly elect a leader that can actually do maybe trash collection or sanitary collection or address the rats? Because I think that's actually very cool in terms of, can we actually have representative leaders that are algorithms? But I raise that because that is a high vision, but then you're soliciting from the public, from the private sector, and people in government, what are those possible projects we want to do? And then again, run it as a gated approach where you pick 16, you give them 4 months to see what they can do, down select to 8, down select to 4. I think that's the only way we're going to be able to move with speed, because technology is just changing so fast that the linear waterfall process we've all shown will not keep up.
Yeah. Andrew, I mean, from the city perspective, you guys do really good stuff with open data. I would guess you're having a lot of these conversations around AI and thinking, how do we replicate this? How do we do something similar? How do we get both the top leadership and also, from the ground up, make this work? What are you guys thinking about right now?
Yeah, I think that's right. And AI is a term that means a lot of things. Within our lab group, I mentioned the RAP model. That wasn't an AI, but I think you could run an AI. You could run it through an AI program,
and figure out where to send
training data. Yeah, exactly. You wouldn't know the factors that I just listed, but you would know where the rats are. But I actually think there are a whole number. There are a whole number of possibilities of ways to use it. I think the challenge in the local government, once again, would be resources, and then trying getting the expertise and the resources to do it right, and then to maintain it, because AI it's not just you train it up once and then you're good to go. You have to maintaining it is as complex. So I think, but in some ways it might even be easier to do at the local level because it's smaller and easier to grasp.
So, in the last election, everyone said, everyone was following Nate Silver and saying, the data doesn't lie, and we trust the data, and obviously these predictions are wrong. If you go back historically, if you go back to the election with Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson, so CBS, this was the first time they said we're going to use the electronic brain. They got that computer, and they said, we're going to go and for the first time try and predict election results using data, using the computer, and see what happens. So they did it, and all the polling beforehand had Adlai Stevenson winning by either a landslide or very closely ahead. They ran their model, and it showed that Eisenhower was going to win, and that not only was he going to win, he was going to win by a large margin, and it was like a 100 to 1 probability. They did it. They lied on air about what the results were from the computer because they all said it couldn't possibly be true. And so, but this is a challenge that I think a lot of times we face, where we do something new, we do something with data or AI, and the kind of the leadership doesn't understand exactly what the result is. If the result doesn't comport with what they expect, they're not going to follow it. And so how do we address that problem? Because people, I think, are now, because of the last election, maybe too concerned that we're just blindly following the computer. I think many times we're actually, the computer's telling us something, and we're not listening to it if it doesn't match our reality, and maybe we should. How do we manage that process?
Well, so I think what you've hit on is we all have biases. I mean, none of us are completely unbiased. And I think partly why I joined the People-Centered Internet Coalition was I think the promise of the 1990s with the internet was that more information online would lead to greater transparency, greater understanding, and greater truth. And I think what we have discovered now in 2017 and beyond is more information online leads to each of us with our own cognitive biases, cherry picking the information we want, and actually leads to fragmentation as opposed to bringing people together. And I think the challenge is you can't force people to read things they don't want to read. And so the question is unanswered. In fact, if anyone has any ideas, I'm happy to talk to you after this event. How can you help people become aware of their biases? And I actually have a hope that maybe AI could actually give you a reflection of yourself. You can imagine in the workplace, there should be absolutely no correlation to your height relative to the amount of money you're earning as a chief financial officer, but unfortunately we know the taller you are, the more money you're getting paid, even though I don't think it equates to your effectiveness as a financial officer. So it could almost say, did you happen to know in the last 10 hirings your company did, these were the types of people you were hiring, and it was skewed this way or the other way, and it can actually begin to show those biases to us because we don't. I mean, it's really hard for people to accept that they have biases until you show it to them. I've taught courses before to military. I mean, these are high-level military generals that claim they have absolutely no bias whatsoever, and then when you show them the data, it's like, oh, okay. And so you hit the nail on the head, which is everybody says they want open government, they want open data, insofar that the data purports to the political ideologies that they want to actually put in place. The moment that the data is contrary to their political ideologies, then you have a challenge of, wait a minute, I don't want that data anymore, it must have been collected wrong, or I'm not going to pay attention to it. I think the challenge we have, though, as a Western representative democracy is politics is the art of compromise, and the internet has almost made what we see going on almost a winner-take-all game. None of us are tolerant when it could be back in the 1960s, 1970s, your congressperson or your elected official could come to their home constituency and say, look at the victory I got you, and nobody would have the background about the other things that they gave up to get you that victory. And so they could compromise, but they could also tell you the story. Now with the internet, unfortunately, they're going to point out, well, wait, you got us this, but you also gave up on this, or you were seen actually siding with the other side on that. And so again, we get the government we deserve. If we don't encourage people to do compromises and do solutions that are less than perfect, we may end up becoming an autocracy of ideas.
Hey.
It's an interesting question. So how do we manage that problem? I think, one, you need to look at the entire life cycle of data, and from its ingest to its output, and make sure you're managing that process. So there's a lot of places where bias can come in. So for example, your data set might be biased. So I'm sure in this case they've collected, they were collecting data from all the polling agencies and things that are drawn with, the lines of voting lines and things like that, but you need to make sure you have diversity in your actual data sets. Then you need to look at the folks that you have developing the models. So if you are relying, data scientists can take months to develop a single model, and that's a lot of labor of love. So if you're relying on a single data scientist who might have an implicit bias, then you need to also look at the diversity in the individuals and how those models are being developed to make sure there's diversity there. So if you don't do those things, you end up with the famous examples of racist chatbots like David and I have talked about before, where that was never the intention. But then you also need to, I'm going to come back to the management of incentives and the outputs. So to David's point, people aren't going to hear what it has to say sometimes. So if you've eliminated bias along the process to the best of your ability, right? Computers are going to do what humans tell the computers to do. Then you also need to support some decisions at the end and give people the rope to walk out on a ledge and say, we should try something else. Because I can guarantee that there was someone, we flipped the coin, we talk about Hillary lost and we didn't see it coming. Someone in the Trump campaign probably looked at the data and said, guys, I think we should actually go to these very unpopular areas and canvass there. And I can guarantee that was a fight internally. So someone stood up and said, yes, we should go do that, and it proved to be effective. And did that happen on the other side of the coin too for the Hillary campaign? Like, did someone else notice those same outcomes, but it wasn't what they were hoping to hear, and not what they thought the public wanted to hear? Who knows? This isn't a political discussion. But the point being, you need diversity in the data, you need diversity in the algorithms, and you need support and the ability to challenge whatever the outcome is. We can't, I don't think DoD is going to put in AI and then just let the machine actually deploy the actual weapon. I hope not, at least. We're still going to have a human element to the outcome. It just might be a little bit better informed. So how are you going to manage that process?
Andrew.
I guess I'll I'll say quickly, this reminds me a little bit, so I don't know if Nate Silver would, first of all, I don't know if Nate Silver would agree with you that he totally missed it, because I think he defends his prediction. But anyway, a different Nate Silver thing, which is his book Signal and Noise, which talks a little bit about, in the 90s, Moneyball, right? And baseball was all about the statistics and cybermetrics. And his book shows that in the 2000s, it actually, and scouts were all afraid that they were going away. We wouldn't need these people. In Signal and Noise, which was written in the late aughts, or maybe the 2010s-ish, he talks about how scouts, they had as many scouts, if not more, than before. Because what happens is you combine the great data with the human element, and those two things go hand in hand. And I think, I see that all the time, where we can't just rely on the data. We need data and really good people. So we'll go back to my example of rats. Like, we still need DPW workers who have an experience knowing how to abate them, where they are, and feeding into the model, verifying it. We don't have the government can't get some things wrong in models. An example, I used to work for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and we created a risk model for non-banks to determine where to go examine. We couldn't, on that first run, we couldn't use the outputs to go schedule. We combined that with what the examiners knew and their on-the-ground human experiences to make the schedule, because we needed to validate our models first. So I guess my point is, I think it's always understanding, respecting, and then learning how to use and leverage that human component in all of the data and the modeling.
So we're kind of closing on time. I want to open up to questions. I have three. I want to bring this back to practical things before we kind of end this panel. So I have three kind of brief questions. The first one touches on risk, which has come up quite a bit. Just kind of very specifically, as government agencies are thinking about, I think it's come up a few times, they need to be tolerant of risk in different ways. How do they actually do that? It's one thing to say they should. How do you actually make an agency do that? Talk us through ways to achieve this.
So I've been a long proponent that we have the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency for the DoD, which can do those things that are risky, and it's expected that they're not all going to work out. We don't have a civilian equivalent. And so you're asking civilian agencies that are already having their budgets cut to then say, do some things that are, I love it whenever you parachute in and they say, yeah, we want you to be innovative, but please don't disrupt anything. And you're like, And so where are those places that you can try things? And it's not, and you don't want to do something, because I've seen other attempts where you create You create this cool kids club separate from all the agencies, and that's not any good either because they're too removed from the front line. What I really want are people that are coming from those government agencies that have experiences that have been there, that are coming to this place where it's okay to have things not work out, it's okay to have things iterate rapidly, but they're bringing their mission experience and they're remembering the mission and they know they're going to go back to their home agency and actually have to put in place what they do. And that's again where I think, I mean, right now, a lot of the hard problems we have in public service do not fit into any one department or agency. So it's almost like you have to identify what are the topics where you want innovation to occur. And I again think it's jobs, healthcare, and maybe training or education. And then actually solicit from both the public sector and the private sector, as well as from government workers, a safe space. I mean, the nice thing is, and Megan and I talked about this, the private sector can shoulder some of that risk because it's less public when it doesn't work out in a private company. In government, you're going to be called before Congress and questions are going to be asked. But again, we have not created that safe space for civilian innovation to occur and to have it then be fed back in a way that is effectively incubated back into their home agencies.
Yeah. Megan, let me ask you a different one. Although feel free to jump in on this one too if you want. But we talked a lot about leadership as well. So should that technology leadership, should it be coming from the CIO or a kind of technical manager, or should it be coming from top executive, or should it be coming from at the bottom? Where do you actually want to see that leadership?
That is a fantastic question. I don't think it can come just from the CIO because back to your usability point, at the very beginning of this conversation, if things aren't built for the people that need them, then people are going to be upset. So I find that innovation, and David makes a fantastic point, we have a lot of innovation offices popping up, and I think they're inherently useful, but a lot of people are saying that's, I'm going to leave that up to the innovation shop and then keep doing my everyday job, when that's not the answer that you want. You want people to stop and say, I'm frustrated today with my job. Why is that? It could be better, and have a mechanism and a forum to recommend that or build it up. I think it's going to come from the program offices, the ones that are solving the actual mission problems, because I think the earlier panel hit on this. You don't want to say, if you're JFK, you're not going to say, we're going to build a rocket and boosters and put a man in a tiny capsule. You're going to say, we're going to go to the moon, and then let NASA figure that out, right? So the people that work for the mission and understand the problems are going to be able to say, this is how this should be fixed. And oh, by the way, now let me work with the CIO shop to say, this technology could apply to my problem. And maybe that's blockchain, maybe that's AI, maybe it's just a process automation tool. You're not sure. So you need to get that groundswell from the folks solving the issue rather than just turning to the technology department. I look at them as almost a support mechanism. Now they need to do education. And they themselves, especially in the government, need to get outside the office to understand the art of the possible, so that we don't end up building things from scratch that we don't need to build. And if you couple those things together, we'll go pretty far. But yeah, I think David, I'm going to just kind of echo what David said. And I had a point, but I completely lost it, probably because it's time for wine then.
Andrew, let me ask you the third one, and feel free to jump on any of these, but I'll you third one. So at the beginning, we talked a lot about kind of inclusive innovation. I want to ask on this one, how do we scale up and scale out on a lot of these issues? So maybe you mentioned the rat stat program a couple times. Yeah. I don't live in DC. If my city wanted to adopt it, how would it go about doing that, and how interoperable sorry, stepping back, when you were designing it, were you thinking about how other cities might want to use it? And if you weren't, how might that have shaped what you were doing?
Yeah, I think something that strikes me continually at the city level is to your point, there's lots going on, and sometimes the transferability of it is sometimes easy. Sometimes we put things on GitHub. For example, we created an economic intelligence dashboard that has all these economic indicators, including census and housing indicators. Both the data feed and then the site itself are all on GitHub. But I think that's an exception rather than a rule in local government in many cases. And so I think we're trying to, I think we constantly try to figure out other ways of sharing how we share with other cities, because we're not trying to own it or make money off of it. And I think depending on the solution, there are different ways to share, but it hasn't, there's not, other than GitHub, there's really not a structural method there. I know that, for example, Bloomberg Philanthropies is a big supporter of that type of sharing of information and best practices. I was part of their convening on autonomous vehicles, for example. They got 10 global cities together to talk about their policies on autonomous vehicles, to think about how we're responding to those as cities. So I think there are elements, but I unfortunately don't have a good structural answer for you on that. I did want to make a point about education that Meagan said, because I think there's a really interesting example. I wish I was there, but I heard about it. We did a thing called Formapalooza this summer. We love naming things. We have all sorts of funny names. Formapalooza this summer, which is all about user experience. It was all about saying we have hundreds of thousands of forms of local government. How can we improve a few of them? And I'll tell you, there was 3 months of that where our team was internally just meeting with DC government employees, the ones who actually have the forms, to teach them about user experience. And because they think, they know why every single box is there, that's their job, and they sort of defend some of them, their first instinct was to defend every piece of data collection rather than to start fresh and say, okay, so when do we need this, why do we need it, and is there an easier way to get it? And so that education piece, even internally, was incredibly important and it took months in order for us to finally get to this public Formapalooza where we got the public in and we actually redesigned the forms. So I think that's a really important element.
Great.
Can I just add one point around the leadership as we talk about innovation? So we keep mentioning we need to learn to fail in the government, but I want to just quickly touch on what that means. And I think part of the job of leadership, do the education back down for the folks that have the problem so they understand what the possible is. But the government needs to do a little bit better job of defining what incremental success looks like and be willing to pull the plug. And that's what we mean by fail. And private sector does it all the time. We do it all the time. Every program we run, we say, we've done that 5 times, now it's tradition. I don't like it, let's change it. Because it's a scary thing to pull a plug on a contract or something you've been building, but it's easier to defend yourself in Congress that, yeah, I wasted $200K of taxpayer dollars instead of 600 million. So I think, but having that definition, and it's not around the outcomes of the technology, it's around the actual business outcomes of what you're trying to achieve. That's where leadership needs to provide that guidance back down.
David, you look like...
Well, I was going to actually amplify too. I'm a big believer that the innovation will come from the programmatic side, but we do need to recognize that sometimes the programmatic side can be held hostage to the way of currently doing things. And so whether that comes from the tech side, whether that comes from the top, whether it comes from someone hired to be the chief instigator or whatever it might be, there needs to be someone that can show the art of the possible to the mission, and then actually ask and say, why are you collecting 900 data elements? Do you still really need 900 data elements? And sort of help people outside of their comfort zone. And that's where I've said before, leadership is the art of basically managing friction. It actually comes from the Greek word lead, which means to be sent unto death. Because back in ancient Greece, the leads were the ones that carried the flag in front of the melee army. And that's all well and good until one ground army meets another ground army. Who's the first to die? The flag bearers. And so if you really are being a leader, if you're being more than a manager, you're being a leader, you're going to incur friction, and people aren't going to always like it. But I think that's sort of the obligation we have to actually have that innovation, have that transformation occur, is actually sort of serve as a chief instigator for showing people the art of the possible and moving things forward.
Thanks. We've got time for a few questions. One right here.
We lost the mic.
I think David's comments at the end there were actually perfect for my question, but I want to get back to something you said earlier about how government's responsibility is to serve all citizens, whereas private companies don't really have that same mandate. I see digital leadership as something that should be inclusive, and cities particularly should have an obligation to be equitable because of their role to serve citizens. So how do you see technology and innovation as an opportunity to bring people into the conversation who maybe have trouble currently accessing government or accessing government services, and where do you see the opportunity there?
Who wants to tackle?
Well, I'll start with a step back. I think in DC, one of the things that we benefit from in the city is that we are we're more inclusive to begin with as a city than other cities, and you'll see that we're the #1 place for women in tech, for example, and we have better numbers compared to other cities in terms of other disadvantaged populations. So one of the things that we've tried to do is actually create opportunities and invest in opportunities for underrepresented entrepreneurs, especially to have places and spaces and financing to move their ideas forward. So I think it's less about government services, but more about the innovation sphere. We just opened in April this year this inclusive incubator it's called In3 on Howard University's campus. And so I think we see our job as saying, well, there are businesses and industries in the city, but there are things that we really want to put our money and our efforts in terms of trying to ensure inclusion. So that's on the economic development side. And then I think on the citizen side, on the government response side, I would argue that we as local government are incredibly responsive. We are incredibly responsive to everybody, and purposely create opportunities for people to meet us wherever they are. And that could be digital media. For some people, that could be walking into our office, which happened. Residents will walk into the city hall and have a question of service, and we work with them. That could be calling, kind of across the different channels of all time, letters, everything. We really need to be responsive, and I think that's just because we're so kind of close to the residents.
Other questions? Yeah.
I like to challenge the Center for Data Innovation to actually act as a coordinator for a lot of these trials, the governments of what they're doing. We got 50 different states doing innovative things with education and healthcare and everything else. That money is being sponsored by the federal government. But we also have, counties and levels, all of these. Please put it together so that people can see what's being out there. GitHub is nice, but it'd be nice if actually you guys actually did that.
Well, we actually started a project that's in beta right now with about 6 states called Digital Transformation Exchange, that's focused on the idea of sharing early proofs of concept. So basically, when a city or local government's done something well that they want to brag about, they describe what happened, how they did it, what the impact was, and here's their contact information if you have questions. So it's the idea of getting ahead of change and making it open, but not in a GitHub way where here's the code, but just kind of in an explanatory way, this is what we did, and here's the idea. So we're actually working on something like that.
So real quick to build on that, I was actually at an event in August with National Association of State Chief Administrators, and so they're like the chief of staff, the chief operating officers for the different states. They are hungry for this, and so if you're open to it, I'll connect you with them, because several states are wanting to do this, and they each feel like they're trying things, but they're kind of doing it kind of blindly. And so again, if we take that trend of the rise of subnationalism, that states and local governments and cities are going to actually be more of the innovators in some respects, because they can actually play to their constituencies more easily, be happy to connect with them.
And my only feedback on that would be, I think broad and shallow is better than narrow and deep. And that is to say, I'd rather have all 50 states, their education department or their Department of Transportation, or all cities have their economic development offices, because I think that the challenge is governments are so vast and the problems they have are so wide that I think narrowing in on the specific topic will, but making sure that when I'm an economic development professional, I can go in and I can see all the really cool things that are happening across the country would be more valuable than, I wouldn't spend any time if it were also the health, it's the health department of this state and it's the transportation department of that state.
That's great feedback, thanks. So we've got one more question up here.
Thank you. Thanks for this panel. My name is Liang. I think we talk about really a lot of issues besides the data, maybe involves data and technology. But you mentioned about data, you mentioned about democracy, and you mentioned just about everything we live. But my question is, can you really do something to improve the well-being of our people and our society? Because currently the data is no reliability, no accountability, and the person who handles the data is the same thing. And if you talk about Census Bureau data, they are getting the data from the officials, which are already wrong to begin with. So, and then if you think about the democracy and the system, they are all rigged. So it's really manipulated or obstructed by the money, which the money may be robbed from the taxpayers, citizens, normal citizens, rather than their effort to produce a democracy. So
let me stop you there so we can get an answer before we run out of time.
right. So if you can really do something to improve our education, maybe online or something to improve our sense of justice and fairness and ethic value.
Okay, so let's do a quick answer on that. How can we make it
Sure.
actually benefit citizens?
So actually, I think to talk about what we do at the People-Centered Internet. So part of the People-Centered Internet, it was created by Metzger, co-founded, and basically it's meant to do demonstration projects that measurably improve people's lives using the internet, particularly trying to bring them together as communities. And so one effort we're doing right now with the wildfires that happened in California, more than 5,500 homes lost their identity documents. And on average, it takes about 4 to 5 years to actually restore your identity. And so we're working with local governments and tech companies to try and reduce that time to being more like 4 to 5 months, but at the same time, prevent the rise of fraud at the same time as trying to get people's identity back. Another example of what we're trying to look at is in Puerto Rico, and it hasn't been approved yet, but we're trying to see with Puerto Rico, how can we help them both establish communications as well as power, but then also look at, because unfortunately dengue fever and Zika are both endemic to the area, can we use that data to help local communities figure out what they need to do for public health, for education, for mosquito netting, and really sort of bring the communities together. And so I think at the end of the day, you have to come back to the communities and ask the communities what do they want, what data do they need, what types of connectivities they need, but it really is about recognizing the power of the community.
Other takers on that question?
Well, I think it addresses this in partially yours, which is if, the government having digital experiences and the ability to input citizen data and have the feedback mechanisms, I think that's the bare minimum, because think about everyone's Christmas shopping right now. You go to a website and it looks pretty sketchy. You assume that they're inherently flawed and you're not going to buy from them. Same with the government. We have that expectation, so we need digital experiences from the government that promote transparency, promote trust. And then let's look at some underlying technologies. Maybe there's applications of blockchain that are going to kind of improve accountability across systems. So we're assuming, I think a lot of times it's quick to jump to the fact that politics and government are the same thing, and they're not necessarily always tied together. So there's a lot of public servants that are doing amazing things to improve citizens' lives. How do we make sure that that's recognized and communicated and provides transparency in a way that garners trust? And then also use technology to hold the political officials accountable, which are the ones largely responsible for some of the issues that you brought in. So not a real answer, but we could probably have a whole topic on that.
A great place to end now. Well, please join me in thanking our panel today.